With the work that we do, we work internationally, so it very much depends on the country that we're in. But I think it's so important to consider the hazards that are exacerbated by climate change or climate variations. In places like South Africa, the amount of rain that we're going to get is going to increase dramatically in certain places, and the drought that we get could increase dramatically in certain places. So it's very much region specific and depends on who we work with. But again, that then comes down to doing your risk assessments well and doing them regularly to understand the changes that are happening. And so that's very much how we view it, is not so much just planning for a single hazard or a single potential disaster that could happen, but very much understanding the areas that we work in.
In a world increasingly facing the challenges of climate change, with the Building Green podcast, we will dive deep into the intersection of architecture, design, urbanism, and environmental responsibility. I'm Ladina Schöpf, your host. I've been an architect and building site manager for the past 10 years. During my studies at ETH in Switzerland, as well as in my working environment, I've had many touchpoints with sustainability, like many of you, I guess. I've also learned to question what I've been told, which is why I decided to go deeper into the topic and uncover what sustainability actually means. My mission is to highlight the transformative power of sustainable architecture, not just as a practice, but as a catalyst for broader societal change. Subscribe for more of our content and enjoy the show. Jess, it's super nice to have you here. I'm very interested in our conversation of how disaster management intersects with architecture. We found out that there are a few points where we're super connected. So you're a professional disaster manager, and you started your own company, Disaster Nomad, recently. Contrary to other podcast guests, you're not an architect or working closely with architecture in your daily life. Nevertheless, your job in disaster management is strongly related to a sustainable built environment. Could you tell me your story? How did you get where you are today?
Of course. First of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. So my journey started in the ocean. So when people ask me, like, okay, tell us about give your elevator pitch for yourself, I always say, so I'm a Christian, I'm a surfer, I'm a philanthropist by heart, and I'm a disaster manager by trade and passion. And I grew up in Durban in South Africa, and very much a water baby. So I was surfing from when I was about 7 years old. I went on to compete as a surfer, and you really start to understand the importance of the natural environment when you're spending that much time in it. And the more time I spent in the ocean, the more I realized humans are really messing things up here. And there's crazy stats out there of like how much oxygen the ocean is actually responsible for producing. It's like up to 50% of the world's oxygen, and there's all sorts of debates around that. But what I knew is I always wanted to make a difference. I think the very cliche of like, I want to make a difference. And I didn't know what I was going to do. I was very much into my sport. And so I was like, I'm going to do sports science. Got accepted for that at Stellenbosch. And without me knowing, my mom applied for disaster management at Stend in South Africa, and phoned me the one day to say, you've been accepted for disaster management. And I was like, what are you talking about? And she's like, just go and have a read, see what it's all about. And when I started to read what disaster management was all about, I was like, this is exactly what I want to be doing with my life. So I went and I studied disaster management it's now NHL Stenden, so their campus in South Africa, and you learn about the entire disaster continuum. So proactive disaster management through to reactive disaster management. And I was always very fascinated about how do we solve for the future problems? How do we think towards what could happen, not just stick a quick fix solution over it. And so I then did my major in international relations in Thailand. I interned with an international disaster response and recovery organization for a year. And at the end of that, they then offered me a permanent position. And so I worked there for close to 5 years, based in South Africa, but traveling internationally to do immediate response deployments, recovery deployments, and always with the idea of never going into fix a community, because that's not what I'm in the business about. It's going into work alongside communities and rather support them in their recovery process. And so at the end of those years, COVID happened, I lost my job, and I was appointed with Western Cape Disaster Management, where I was responsible for all the risk and vulnerability assessments that happen in the Western Cape province. And there's a big intersect between risk and development. So looking very much at the built environment and understanding where all the risks lie, what interventions can we put in place. And it was a very cool learning opportunity. But in that time, I then started to see how my heart really lay in the humanitarian side of things. And I wanted to move back into that space. I'd had my own consultancy running since about 2019 called Disaster Nomad. And at the start of 2023, I decided to go full-time into that. And so now we work with corporates, nonprofits, government agencies, and looking at how do we build resilience and how do we make solutions sustainable, because the globe is changing, and there's differences in climate, there's all sorts of things that are happening that we never expected. And so there's a really unique intersect there where if you'd asked me 10 years ago, does architecture and disaster risk reduction fit together? I would have looked at you like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But now it's impossible to think about a future where these things don't come together.
During our conversation, I'd like to go deeper into that intersection between disaster management and sustainable architecture. You mentioned before that you're not there to, I think you said, to teach others how it works for them rather than, I don't know. Can you go deeper into that with examples?
Of course. So in recent years, while working in the field, let's start there, I've seen how disaster risk reduction can be done really well and how it can be done really badly. And usually it's when outsiders, so Westerners, go into areas, and for example, Africa. I'm from Africa, but I would never begin to claim that I understand all the cultures in Africa, because every country, every tribe is different. And the problem comes in where outsiders come in and they say, right, we're gonna build you a structure. It's going to be great. It's going to prevent floods, and you're never going to have to worry. And these structures don't take into account any of the cultural nuance of the places. And so what I am really passionate about and work very hard to do is, rather than going into an area that has either been affected by a disaster or could be affected by a disaster, is rather go in and start to understand that community and say, what is it that you need? What would help you, and how can I support you in that? And there's a concept, indigenous knowledge. I'm sure a lot of people have heard about it, but people who have lived in areas for a very long time, they live a certain way because they understand the environments in which they live. And I think just off camera, off podcast, we were chatting and I shared the example of in the US Virgin Islands. So the US Virgin Islands it's such an incredible place and a mix of cultures and people from all over. And there's some very dark history there as well of a slave trade that happened. And so a lot of African communities or individuals that were brought from Africa to the US Virgin Islands. And with that, they brought a lot of their culture. And when we did a deployment to the islands following hurricanes, I think it was Maria that we were there after, Irma and Maria, that we had arrived, we landed, and as we were flying in, I looked at these islands and I was like, oh my gosh, there's nothing. It was just flattened by these hurricanes. And as we started to drive around the islands, the only thing that was left standing were these circular buildings that were built very much like a traditional rondavel, a Zulu traditional rondavel. And we'd asked the people that were there said, yeah, those are the people that have, their families have been here for decades now. And those structures stood because there were no corners on them. And so the wind couldn't catch on any cornices. It couldn't catch on anything and decimate them. And so this island with these incredible hotels and resorts that were all destroyed, there stood these little homes in amongst that. And so that for me was such a clear indication of why you can't just go in and assume something, why you have to go in and work alongside the people that live there. There's other examples of work that's been done in Southeast Asia where NGOs have gone in and just gone in and built these prefab homes for people, not taking into account their culture and how they live. They like to live in a big shared space with separate sleeping quarters. And so they would rather not even live in the home. They would rather find somewhere else because it's not conducive to who they are as people. And so that then got us talking more and more about how do you bring in architects, how do you bring in developers and incorporate all these things together? How do you build something that's really strong and really disaster resilient, that if the same type of disaster were to happen, the impacts are not going to be the same, but how do you make sure that it is applicable to the people that you are supporting? So it's been a really fascinating learning journey because I definitely would not proclaim to be anywhere near an architect, not my skill set, but we have to be able to work with a variety of industries if we're going to build a future that is actually sustainable and caters to people in the way that allows them to feel comfortable and express themselves how they should be able to.
So I guess you also have to analyze quite strongly with them, like their resources, their building techniques, their traditional architecture and everything.
Exactly.
And you also mentioned once the importance of public spaces, or how public spaces can help the resilience of a town or whatever. Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely, and this I love so much. So there's quite a few people in our industry in the disaster risk reduction specifically, that are looking at the use of public open spaces as disaster risk reduction, to convert them so that they can be used by the public, but also that they serve a purpose as a disaster risk reduction intervention. And so there is a park in China, and I hope I pronounced it correctly, but it's Yanweqiu Park in Jinhua City. And this park has been converted in its entirety to now act as a flood mitigation measure. So for a long time, these spaces, either the disaster risk reduction intervention was really ugly to look at, but it served a purpose, or it was these beautiful spaces, but there was no function to them apart from it being a nice park. And so what these scientists and disaster practitioners have started to do is look at these public spaces, say, how can we convert this? How can we incorporate natural vegetation? How can we change the way that these areas are structured so that not only is it a beautiful space to be utilized, rather than just being, for example, a big cement blockade for floodwaters, but rather that it is, in that case of the park, it's now like a giant wetland with these beautiful bridges and paths that wind over it. But when a flood happens, because of all the natural vegetation that they've incorporated into that area, it's now preventing the floodwater from going beyond and into the communities that surround it. And people can still utilize that space even when that region is essentially under flood.
That's so beautiful.
Yeah.
Do you have more examples, like specific examples from your work experiences, from moments you had to go? I think you once mentioned you were in Peru.
Yes, yeah. So we worked in Peru on a number of occasions with the organization I was with. And one of the amazing things that I saw there was, so the organization was volunteer-based. and people could volunteer from anywhere. And this organization would give them a funnel that they could come through. So instead of people just arriving in a disaster zone and being like, I'm here to help, and it causes more chaos than it's worth, this organization would funnel them through. And if you had a specific skill set, you would then be able to say, I'm an architect, I'm an artist, I'm a builder, I'm a plumber, whatever it is, and be able to use those skills. And in fact, I think I wasn't on the program in Nepal when it happened, but I think they did this in 2 locations. But what they did was work with the communities to understand what kind of homes they traditionally would live in. They worked with them to understand what are the things that they worry about. So do they worry about floods? Do they worry about earthquakes? And then this couple, they were both architects, and they came in and helped to design structures that were made entirely out of bamboo. And they used all like bamboo joints. So there was no metal and screws and all that hardware. The structures were built in a way that there were really strong joins in that bamboo and in the wood that they utilized. And those structures then were built in a way that they were completely earthquake resilient up to a certain scale, because obviously you can't plan for the extreme eventualities. Well, you can plan for them, but you hope they never arrive. And so those structures, they were very much built in partnership with the communities. They were built in a way that they felt comfortable to live in them. And should a disaster happen, should an earthquake happen, or should a flood happen because they were stilted, those families that were living in those structures had a reasonable amount of resilience to that kind of event taking place. On top of the function of those structures, they were just absolutely beautiful to look at. I think I've spent many hours looking at Pinterest boards of like, what would I want my home to look like one day? And if you were to look at what's on Pinterest and you were to look at what was built by essentially community members and volunteers, it's just remarkable. And I think a lot of people go, oh, it's got to be ugly for it to be functional. That was a perfect example of, no, it doesn't. It can serve both purposes.
There were a lot of disasters last year here in South Africa along the coast.
Yeah.
What would you say are the most important approaches someone can take that's just building a home along the coast here to be protected against big storms, winds, water?
Yeah. So there's a few things that you can do. The first thing is get a risk assessor in and understand where your home should be built. Obviously, we all want the beautiful, idyllic, scenic views that we can sit and stare at the ocean. But the first step is, if you can afford it, obviously find a place that you can move and be a little further away if we're talking coastal. I think on a bigger scale, and it's that thing of all the small actions add up. The biggest thing is nature-based solutions. So when you are designing your home or designing your structure, how do you incorporate the natural elements that are actually going to serve as the best kind of disaster prevention? A friend of mine was chatting with me yesterday, and she is an architect. She works with like a landscape architect. I have no idea what that is. She tried to explain it. But
it's like a sophisticated gardener.
Exactly. But she helps to design spaces that then incorporate the indigenous vegetation, natural vegetation. So they work alongside the structural architect and build out the area around your home in a way that you are incorporating things that help to buffer in the case of a disaster. So natural vegetation is incredible in helping with limiting flood runoff, in making sure that your embankments around your home stay stable. If we're talking about at a city level or at a government level, rather than converting stretches along the beachfront to these amazing restaurant strips, look at transforming those back into incredible, those public open spaces we were talking about, replanting mangroves, obviously working with ecologists to understand, is that right for the area, maintaining kelp forests, and then bringing in architects and building structures that work with that space and not against it. And I think for me, that is the big thing, is we are, in South Africa, we have a lot of people who it would be a luxury to do a lot of this stuff. And so you build normally for necessity. And I think there needs to be a shift at a government or at an organizational level to say, you know what, the money that we spend on the prevention and build it right once rather than trying to fix it 8 times over in the future. That for me is, I think, what can be done quite quickly if people start to shift their mindsets.
Yeah, back to that Band-Aid solutions that you mentioned. What are some practical steps that architects and urban planners can do in an urban setting that move away from these Band-Aid solutions, or also from examples that you have seen?
So I want to go back to what I was talking about of industries staying siloed, and how I would never have put disaster management and architecture together. And I think it's important that architects start to think about the future and what not only what is your building doing for itself, but what is it doing for the planet. And if you are building, whether it's a high-rise or it's a basic home, what are the things that you can incorporate into the design and into it looking beautiful that are also functional? So I think for a lot of buildings, starting to look at, is it worth spending a little bit of extra money incorporating solar panels on the roof? That helps with, especially in South Africa, where we have very limited electricity. But it starts to take pressure off the grid. It starts to take pressure off the country. You start to think about how the gardens that you have, that you're going to bring someone into landscape, can you turn any of those into food gardens around the home, that suddenly allowing that home to kind of start feeding themselves a bit, and again taking pressure off of the communities around them.
Yet you also said building communities is like a huge passion of yours, or something you really believe in. Do you have specific examples how that helped in other projects? Like you mentioned the project in Peru where people that came to help kind of build the community. Mm-hmm. And how do you think building communities empowers the resilience?
One of the most important parts of resilience building. Currently, I think the way that we live is, it's really quite sad sometimes. That's like, I think I know 1 or 2 of my neighbors in the block that I live in. And if anything were to happen, I don't really think that they would come and check on me, because it's not that kind of community. And I think if we can look towards a future where we are encouraging that community support, that if something were to happen, you're there to strengthen each other, but also in your day-to-day, that you are constantly thinking of, what can I do that uplifts my community, that in turn it benefits me. If you want to take it back to it being selfish, how do I benefit myself? Rather think of it as, how do I improve my community? Because in turn, I know it's going to be better for me. And there's so many examples of where it's been done well. But when I was working in Peru, one of the things that was just incredible there was you had members of the community who they themselves had been through this absolutely horrendous ordeal. So there were major landslides and mudslides that had happened, and it had totally decimated this community that we were working in. And yet it was those community members that came together and they're like, how can I help? How can I help my neighbors? Completely selfless and thinking of, what can I do for other people? Because I know in turn it's going to be good for me in the end. But they were doing it with a completely selfless lens. And so when we went in there to go and work alongside them and support and see how can we help, and we thought, cool, we're going to go in, we're going to build homes. Great, that's going to be the best. And they're like, no, that's not what we want. We would really prefer it if you can help us build almost like a community center. So it was a mix of a school/community center, because in Peru, dancing is a huge part of their culture, and coming together to dance and to sing and to eat. That for them, they'd lost a big part of that with a lot of these villages, but that village in particular being so decimated, they didn't have that place. And it also meant they didn't have a safe space that their children could go to every day, that they knew this structure is safe for them. I can go and I can rebuild my home and I can go and find work, but I know that my children are safe. And so we then helped them to build this community center. And it meant then that every day the children could go there. They had teachers, they could get meals, everything provided there. And the parents didn't have to worry about them. But it also meant that structure then doubled as like a safe house in the case of another flood or another disaster, because we put resources into building that in a way that it wasn't just serving the community function of we want to dance and we want to celebrate together, but it also served a purpose in terms of risk reduction. And so a space like that, where you work with architects, you work with the community, you work with disaster risk reduction practitioners, and you all come together on a single project that then serves this purpose, with this multi-purpose that is helping to further the community. And it means that in the wake of disasters, parents can continue to earn a living, they can continue to go about their daily job. It doesn't completely decimate the economy, even though there are going to, of course, be impacts, but at least those families can continue and they know that there's a safe place. And I think it's when you start to see those examples happening all over the world of how community does come together, it just makes me realize, like, where I live in my beautiful apartment here in Cape Town, how at risk I actually am, because I don't have that kind of network. And as things start to change globally, what does that look like for where I live? Can I depend on my neighbors? Can I band together in the way that they do? And I think it's something that we all need to start looking towards.
That's such a beautiful thought. And it just reminded me, I have a question in mind, but that question reminded me of when I was living in Brazil. I was studying architecture there. I did my exchange semester there in Sao Paulo. And our project was about the community centers, like the cultural centers within the favelas, so their slums. And I remember we could go to every slum and go see their cultural center. And we had to choose one slum, like between a few that didn't have a cultural center. And we had to plan a project there. And I found it so nice that they had, like, each slum had their own cultural center, where you would say, like, I think for me, up until that point, culture was more like a luxury good. And there I saw how important it is that it doesn't have to be a Picasso painting that you look at in a museum.
Yeah.
Just can be a local artist, but it just brings people together, like a creativity, actually.
Yeah.
And so my question might be a bit critical, but I think you've thought about it probably already. Do you think there is a way to get that kind of community sense within our urban setting, where there's no disaster right now, or before a disaster happens?
It's actually one of the biggest challenges that we face as disaster managers and disaster risk managers, because when everything's good, people don't want to spend money. They're like, but why? Why would I want to do this? Or they don't want to spend money or time. They're like, but it's fine. There's no problem right now. And then when when something does happen, and it's like, oh crap, now what? The amount of money you've got to spend at that point is so much higher. And there was a study came out, and it's like for every dollar that's spent on preventing disasters from happening, it is a $4 to $7 saving on responding when a disaster does happen. And so when I think about that in light of communities and context and culture and all those things, for me, it's really about how do you change people's mindsets to a large extent at a government level? How do you get governments to realize that money they're spending is going to be far better spent on preventing than trying to respond to something? And if you are building a structure, if you are designing a public space, how do you then work with communities and say, okay, what do you need? What do you want? And bring in maybe slightly more expensive alternatives that are going to serve a function at that point, and convince people that it's a good idea to spend the money now, because if it's working, you actually aren't going to be able to prove that it's working, which is the complete irony of it. And that's always been the difficult thing, is like, okay, but we did all this stuff, and how do we know? And I'm like, well, it flooded every year until you did that, so we know it's working. And it's a very, very intricate game of chess that you've got to play with all of these pieces, because you can't leave the cultural aspect out. You can't leave the design, the beautiful design aesthetic out of it. You can't leave the functional disaster risk reduction piece out of it, because then it's not going to serve any purpose. There's a really crazy example. I think it's somewhere in Southeast Asia of, so there was a region of coast that was at very high risk of tsunamis. But this region of coast was used a lot by the local communities. It was visited by tourists because it was absolutely beautiful. But they decided, you know what, we need to protect people that live there, so we're going to put up a massive tsunami prevention wall. And suddenly, tourists weren't coming there anymore, because now there's just this giant cement wall up. And so the aesthetics are gone. The cultural aspect's gone, because people don't have a place to go to and celebrate together and just spend time and have fun. So you lose that, but now you've got a great functional piece. And it's still not serving its purpose, because now suddenly the economy starts to tank and you can't figure out why. It's like, oh, because now all these tourists were coming in to see this beautiful space, and it's not serving its purpose anymore in that way. Great, if there's a tsunami, it's going to help in limiting the impacts there, but there's so many other ways we could do that.
A few of you might know that I recently opened my own architecture studio, and I just started with the podcast. I'm very excited to build a platform where I connect with inspiring people to learn along the way and share these learnings with you. So if any little thing has inspired you, or if you learned anything new, I'd appreciate if you could rate the show or share my content on social media, Spotify or YouTube, or wherever you listen to it. And if you think there are any touch points between you and me, I'd be super happy to connect with you. Feel free to reach out on any platform. I had a podcast interview with Ladina Schöpf. She works for C40, so I think I told you about her. And she also said that they see that their job is like kind of to educate mayors of cities on how to make more sustainable urbanism. Yeah. And she said the most problems they see are with cities that have like, contrary of a holistic approach, that have like the Department of let's say infrastructure, the Department of Mobility, Department of Greenery, like parks and everything, and the Department of Housing, and everybody works separately. But once they put them all together, things start to move much faster.
So it's honestly the only way that we are going to get to, in my opinion, the only way we're going to get to a place where we are actually moving towards a sustainable future is when people start to work together.
That's why we're sitting together.
Exactly.
So Jess, let's talk about money. Who pays usually? I guess before the disaster happens, so in the prevention phase.
Yeah.
Is that the government? Are these private people? And who pays after something has happened?
So in South Africa, we have a great disaster management structure. So the way that it works is you have a national disaster management center that's seated up in Pretoria. You then have provincial centers that operate in each of the provinces, and then that kind of filters down. So then you'll have district level centers and you'll have local centers. And all of them are responsible for various aspects. Money-wise, government is responsible for the public spaces, and they should be putting in interventions. They should be looking towards risk reduction. But again, like I said, it's very difficult for governments to spend money on something when they can't prove that it's actually going to happen. And so that's where it's really tricky, and that's where NGOs, corporates via their CSR arm come in. And so before disasters happen, you have a lot of NGOs that are starting to look at the figures that are now coming out, because disaster management is actually a very new industry. And so only now we're starting to get this data coming out that's saying, hey, if you spend this money now, we can guarantee that when something happens, it's going to be way better for you. And so those NGOs, to a large extent, are now taking on a lot of that responsibility and helping to then support government departments in putting in the preventative measures. When a disaster does happen, there's, again, a couple of different mechanisms. NGOs and government kind of work together, but you do have the disaster management centers that will have a response team. They'll send people out to do assessments of communities and then provide those assessments to the individuals that then say, okay, we've got this amount of funding. How do we divide it up? Who do we provide what to? And then NGOs that will have very specific missions. So Save the Children South Africa, their focus is obviously on children and families with children. And they look at making sure that child's rights are protected, that they have a safe place to go during a disaster. And there's a variety of other NGOs that will then kind of focus on their different aspects. I think it's really important to also look at the socioeconomic standing of the country and the demographics. So in South Africa, we have huge disparities here of like extremely wealthy to extremely impoverished. And so the government will generally help those informal settlements go in and make sure that those people do receive support and assistance along with the NGOs. Because most people that are living in urban areas will have home insurance, etc. And so their insurance will then pay for the damages to their home and to their infrastructure.
Interesting. Yeah. And do you know if there's like a set percentage of how much of the government's disposable money they use for risk prevention, or does it vary?
Yeah, it really varies depending on the province, actually. So Western Cape Disaster Management is, they really are kind of like a flagship, if you want to say like a flagship child, like the star child of disaster management in South Africa. And they put a lot of time and a lot of money into their disaster risk reduction. I may also be biased because I did work there, but I can attest to the fact that we spent a lot of time starting with risk assessments. So that was my job, and you do a thorough assessment of the various areas and understand what are the hazards that are most prevalent in those areas, what is the exposure to those hazards, do the communities have any added vulnerabilities that will worsen those impacts? What are the things that allow them to respond well or that make them resilient? And then understanding a risk score for each of those. And based off of that, then prioritizing resources and implementing various interventions, looking at early warnings being sent out. So they spend a good percentage, and I would say most of their time and financial spend is on the prevention side of things. But again, it just depends on where you are, what resources are available, and whoever's responsible for that region, how they view prevention versus response.
And you've mentioned investment. What are other challenges that you've had, like the biggest challenges to convince stakeholders for more sustainable solutions?
I think the two big things is money. So people always think it's expensive and they don't want to do that. And like we've touched on already, there's a huge amount of saving if you rather do it from the start. But the other thing is really just the aesthetics of it. And I think this more so comes into like the architectural world, if I want to put it that way. So not so much the government space, but trying to convince people to implement risk reduction into their homes, into their buildings or their businesses. People want their building to stand out. They want it to be beautiful. And understandably so. If you are spending millions on a structure, you want it to be beautiful. And I think that has been a really difficult selling point because people can't see it. They've only ever seen the ugly version, and it's ugly. And so, if there's any architects out there that want to work with me on making beautiful solutions, let me know. But that's been a really big challenge, is that people, they want it to look good and they're almost willing to sacrifice the longevity of it because they think, well, I've got to have a giant cement wall or there's nothing that I can do. And that really isn't the case. I think one of the other big challenges that we face with getting investment into these kinds of projects is that it goes back to the thing of people want proof. And so one of the big things that we try to do as Disaster Nomad is be data-driven as far as possible and make decisions that are evidence-based. And so if we can start to find solutions that once you've implemented something, be it in a school, in a public space, even in a home, that people can start to track that impact and be able to say, right, yes, last year in June, we had a major flood. The year before in June, we had a major flood. This year, we didn't have a flood. And it gets to June the following year, okay, we didn't have a flood again. Suddenly, that data starts to tell us a really amazing picture, starts to paint a really amazing picture. And that is so important for the future, not just for investment, but also for identifying where risks lie, because we talk about something called a dynamic risk assessment. So I've alluded to it already, where you don't just do the risk assessment once and you're done. You've got to be doing it constantly. And so we've actually partnered with a company called Tree, who has this platform. It's essentially a mobile app with a dashboard, but what it allows is for community members to now be data collectors, for homeowners to be data collectors, for organizations to set up a program and have people giving feedback. And it all feeds into this dashboard that you can then go in and you can better understand the area that you're working in. So especially for governments where they are trying to see where should we be spending money when a disaster hasn't yet happened, they can look back on that data, they can look at trends, they can understand where are people most at risk, and then implement those kinds of interventions that are actually going to be far more sustainable in future. So that, I think, is going to be really important in the future as well, that more of these data-driven solutions come in, because otherwise it's literally, you're just like shooting in the dark, trying to figure out how do we make changes or convince people like, hey, spend all this money. And they're like, why? I've got no proof. And so that for me is going to be a huge stepping stone. It's something that I think there's traction building, but we need a lot more of it to be done.
Do you have a favorite project you want to mention?
So I really do love that park in China, which I had nothing to do with, but I just think it's incredible. I think another amazing example is actually the Green Village in Bali. And there they've built a sustainable co-living space entirely out of bamboo and very much working with the environment, and looking at how to make this entire space sustainable. So I think those are my two favorite things that I've come across so far. And of course, the project we worked on when we built those homes, I think those are really unique and really, it's something that people can aspire to. There's also, in fact, a very cool project that, again, I have had nothing to do with. I just met the person that came up with this concept, but it's something called amphibious homes, which when I heard this, I was like, what the heck? Because I've only ever heard of like frogs as amphibians. And what they have done is they have designed structures that sit on, I believe it's like big metal poles that are fixed into the ground. But under the home, they build these like pontoons out of recycled plastic. So old bottles, so milk bottles, water bottles, etc., plastic they find, they tie them so that there's air inside. They strap all of this together and then they place them under the homes and build the homes on top of that. And when floodwater comes, because the home is then pinned in by these poles, what happens is that the whole structure floats up, and so the family is safe inside. They float up until the floodwater subsides and the whole home then floats back down. And that for me is, it's maybe not entirely aesthetically pleasing, but that design and the concept around that is just absolutely remarkable, because for areas that are constantly at risk of flooding, suddenly these families now don't need to worry so much about evacuating and trying to take their personal belongings or worrying about losing stuff in these events. They know my home is a safe space, and I'm going to be a couple meters higher, but that's fine. I'm not going anywhere. I make sure I have enough food and water, stay in the structure until we all float back down and we're back on ground.
That's so interesting. You have to send me the project. So cool.
Yeah, really incredible.
It's amazing. And I mean, from that concept on, you could then develop a more sophisticated solution.
Exactly.
And have a beautiful solution.
Yeah, exactly.
And looking towards the future, what disasters are you currently planning to avoid?
All of them.
Are the aliens coming? I'm planning on having a podcast interview with a space architect. Do you think, how close do you think we are to that?
Listen,
between us?
I really hope that there are no aliens coming, because I have no mitigation plans for that one.
Okay.
With the work that we do, we work internationally, so it very much depends on the country that we're in. But I think it's so important to consider the hazards that are exacerbated by climate change or climate variations. And so in places like South Africa, the amount of rain that we're going to get is going to increase dramatically in certain places, and the drought that we get could increase dramatically in certain places. So it's very much region specific and depends on who we work with. But again, that then comes down to doing your risk assessments well and doing them regularly to understand the changes that are happening, and staying in touch with people like the South African Weather Service. So again, it's bringing all these individuals from different sectors together. And so that's very much how we view it is not so much just planning for a single hazard or a single potential disaster that could happen, but very much understanding the areas that we work in. I think down in the Western Cape, where I live currently, we know that in winter, risk of flood is extremely high. And so then it's working with NGOs, working with directly with communities or with corporates who do want to make a change, and rather looking towards community-centric solutions. So what is the community seeing? What is it that they say they need, like we've touched on, and then planning for those events. Of course, we always consider the outliers that could potentially happen. And, things like earthquakes, they've happened in the Western Cape, but they are very rare just because of where we position geographically. And so then rather saying, right, we know that could happen, have a plan in place, but rather focus our energy on the things that we know happen more frequently. So that's kind of how we view it. It's very much depending on where we are, taking into account what's happening. But I would say most of the time spent is on the climate related stuff. And so a lot of the projects that we do take on and the individuals that we work with, and this is very much where the architecture side of things would come in, is starting to incorporate those sustainability or sustainable elements into the structures that we build. So planning for power outages, putting solar panels in, putting in wind turbines where it's appropriate. And just thinking about making tweaks that where people agree, okay, it's going to cost us a little more, they're happy to do it because they know in future we're prepared.
So interesting. And so one last personal question. What is something you had to ditch or you think our audience should ditch to have a more sustainable lifestyle?
There's two big ones for me. The first one is trend chasing. And this is, I think it affects so many aspects of our lives, from fashion to food to everything. But especially with something like disaster risk reduction and architecture, is do it right once and be happy with it. Of course, like I said, if you're spending millions on building a structure, you want it to be something that makes you happy. And I think that's maybe the crux of it, is what makes you happy? What's something that you're going to be happy with for 10, 15, 20 years, rather than the latest trend because it's maybe going to get you a cool Instagram photo. And in my industry, there's always like the latest and greatest research coming out. And I think of course, we need to constantly be changing and incorporating those things, but there's also the tried and tested, and it's going to work, and stick with those basics as far as possible. So I think in many areas of our lives, that's the one thing we can all do to be more sustainable. And then also just shut up and stop trying to be the expert. I've often found when working alongside communities, if you just listen, oftentimes the answers find you, and they are the best solutions to something. So rather than going in there and trying to be the loudest voice in every room, be like, I know best, I know exactly what I need to do. If we often just quieten ourselves and listen, you can start to see, actually, that's a really good idea. That's something that's going to be far more beneficial, not just to me, but to my family and to my community. And so I think those are the two things we can all do to live more sustainbly.
That's a wonderful ending. I think we all learned a lot.
I hope so.
All in the room.
I hope so.
Super interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been amazing. I really, really appreciate you having me on.
A huge thank you for listening. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to the podcast to support me and so you don't miss an episode. And while you're there, I'd also be so grateful if you could rate and review us. If you have any guest suggestions or any feedback, you can find me on the socials at Ladina Schöpf. Thanks.